It was the kind of cold that crept into your bones and stayed there. Late November 2006. The boardwalk lights of Atlantic City glowed faintly in the distance, but behind the old Golden Key Motel, the world was silent. Just reeds, water, and the faint hum of traffic on the Black Horse Pike. Two local women, cutting through the overgrown access road that afternoon, weren't supposed to be there. They were taking a shortcut, talking quietly, when one of them noticed something pale tangled in the weeds beside the ditch. At first, it looked like a torn piece of clothing, maybe a blanket someone dumped, but then the wind shifted, and what they thought was fabric caught the light just enough to show skin. One woman froze. The other stepped closer and saw it, a hand, swollen and pale, floating just above the surface of the water. The 911 call came in at 3:02 p.m. The dispatcher's tone changed the second the words, "possible body," were said. Within minutes, Egg Harbor Township police units were pulling into the narrow dirt road behind the motel, tires sinking into the soft ground. The place was a forgotten strip of marshland wedged between the back of the Golden Key and the pines beyond. A perfect place for someone who didn't want to be seen. By the time the first detective arrived, the afternoon sun was low enough to cast long shadows across the ditch. The woman in the water lay face down, her hair fanned out like a veil, fully clothed but barefoot. An officer radioed for the medical examiner. Then, one of them walked a few yards down the ditch and stopped. There was another shape, then another. By 3:30, the number was 4. The scene fell into a strange kind of quiet. No one spoke for several minutes. The ditch stretched maybe 50 feet, lined with cattails and muddy water, just deep enough to conceal what was beneath. 4 women, all face down, all barefoot, all pointing east, toward Atlantic City. The uniformity was too deliberate to ignore. Detectives marked the positions with yellow flags, stepping carefully along the embankment to avoid disturbing the water. One officer whispered that it looked like they'd been arranged. As the light faded, more units arrived. Crime scene, county investigators, the medical examiner's team. A floodlight was brought in, its harsh glow bouncing off the motel's back wall. From the parking lot, curious guests stared, whispering behind half-closed curtains. Some had lived there for months, others were just passing through. The smell of gasoline, marsh water, and decay filled the air. Detective Sergeant Peter Martin of the Atlantic County Prosecutor's Office later said it was one of the most haunting scenes he'd ever walked into. The bodies had been there for different lengths of time. One seemed relatively recent, the others more decomposed. That meant they hadn't died together. Someone had been coming back to this same spot again and again, using the same ditch as if it belonged to him. Each woman's head faced the same direction, east. Their shoes were missing. None appeared to have been robbed. Their clothing was intact. No defensive wounds visible, at least not yet. Whoever did this hadn't left chaos behind, just silence. As forensic techs moved through the site, every step created ripples in the shallow water. They photographed the alignment, marked distances, then began the slow process of recovery. One by one, the bodies were lifted out and placed on tarps, each tagged by position. Investigators used boards to stand on so they wouldn't sink. Even then, several lost their footing in the mud. The ditch wasn't deep, but it was soft, like it didn't want to let go. By nightfall, flashing red and blue lights painted the motel walls. Reporters were already gathering by the highway shoulder, trying to see through the line of squad cars. A motel employee, still wearing his apron from the front desk, told an officer he'd noticed a bad smell for weeks, but thought it was a dead animal. No one had gone behind the property in months. That stretch of ground wasn't maintained, too wet, too forgotten. The victims were taken to the county morgue just after 8 p.m. The first autopsy wouldn't begin until the next morning, but detectives stayed at the scene through the night. The ditch was drained inch by inch to search for evidence. They found a single women's shoe downstream, a cigarette butt wedged in the mud, a scrap of fabric, possibly from a jacket sleeve. But none of it explained the order, the eastward alignment, the bare feet, the silence. By midnight, word had reached the Atlantic County Prosecutor's Office that this wasn't an isolated discovery. 4 women, all placed carefully, strongly suggested a single offender, someone organized, someone deliberate. The working theory forming in whispers among investigators was chilling. A serial killer had been operating along the margins of Atlantic City, and no one had noticed. Outside the taped-off area, The November wind carried the sounds of sirens and highway noise. From a distance, the Golden Key Motel looked almost normal. Neon vacancy signs still flickering, guests coming and going. But behind it, under the harsh glare of portable lights, officers waded knee-deep in water that had hidden a nightmare. Reporters began calling it the Marsh Murders before dawn. Others would soon give it another name, the Eastbound Strangler, after the way the bodies had been lined up facing toward the ocean. In the early hours of November 21st, detectives took their first tentative walk through the motel's parking lot. Room 101 was occupied. A man inside said he'd seen nothing. He'd been staying there on and off for weeks. When asked if he'd noticed anyone near the ditch, he shook his head. The sound of traffic and the motel's buzzing light made it easy not to hear much of anything. But the officers noticed something else, a line of footprints in the mud near the rear fence. Barefoot, partial, too distorted to cast. The water had already blurred them beyond use. The following morning, newspapers across New Jersey carried a single line: 4 bodies discovered behind an Atlantic City motel. Investigation underway. No names, no details, just a place and a number. Inside the county morgue, examiners began the long process of identification. Dental records, missing persons reports, fingerprints where possible. It would take days before all 4 were named. For now, they were Jane Does, women who had been forgotten until they were found face down in the marsh. At the scene, detectives stayed long after the media left. The water had turned a dull brown from disturbance. They stood at the edge of the ditch, looking down the line where the bodies had been. The symmetry still didn't make sense. Someone had taken the time to align them, to remove their shoes, to make sure they all faced east. That detail would haunt investigators for years. By the end of the second day, the motel's owner handed over his guest records. Detectives began the slow process of cross-referencing every name, every check-in, every room. They looked for patterns, repeat guests, vehicles that matched witness reports, maintenance staff with unusual hours. Nothing stood out yet, but everyone involved felt the same chill. Whoever had used that ditch might have stayed in one of those rooms, watching from behind a curtain, waiting for sirens to fade. As dusk fell again, the motel glowed under weak neon. The marsh was quiet once more. Only the yellow tape fluttered in the wind. But the image of those 4 women, lying face down, heads turned east toward the lights of Atlantic City, was burned into every investigator's mind. None of them would ever forget that alignment, or the eerie calm of that place. They didn't know their names yet. They didn't know what connected them. But the discovery behind the Golden Key Motel was only the beginning of a story that would unravel over months, then years. A story that would draw lines between addiction, survival, and something far darker hiding just beyond the edge of the city's glow. By morning, the names began to surface. It started with a call from the county morgue to the detective bureau. One of the women had been identified through a match to old arrest records. Her name was Barbara Breedor, 42 years old, once a college student, later a waitress, and finally another name in Atlantic City's growing list of women who disappeared and never came home. Within 48 hours, 3 more identities would follow: Molly Dilts, Tracy Ann Roberts, and Kim Raffo. Each had vanished separately, weeks apart, from the same narrow strip of the city where addiction and survival met under neon light. At first glance, they seemed like 4 very different people, different ages, different stories, different families waiting for calls that never came. But as detectives began to build the timelines, one pattern stood out so clearly it chilled them. Every one of these women had been living on the margins. Everyone had struggled with addiction. Everyone had turned to the streets near the casinos, where tourists rarely looked twice at the women standing under street lamps. And now, every one of them had ended up face down in the same ditch. The first file on the table belonged to Molly Jean Dilts. She was only 20. Born and raised in Black Lick, Pennsylvania, she had grown up quiet, artistic, and hopeful. Someone who still believed she could turn her life around. But after a series of bad choices and a boyfriend who introduced her to heroin, she slipped further from home, eventually ending up in Atlantic City in late summer of 2006. For a while, she tried to get clean. She'd even called her mother, promising that she'd found a job and was staying in a women's shelter. That was the last time anyone heard her voice. Police would later determine she was likely the first of the four to die. By the time her body was found, decomposition had erased most of the details, including the cause of death. To detectives, that made her both the beginning and the silence, the first woman to vanish and the one who left the fewest answers. Next came Barbara Bredor. Her case file was thicker. Born in 1964, she'd grown up in a well-to-do neighborhood in Huntingdon Valley, Pennsylvania. She'd gone to Catholic school, even spent 2 years at Penn State. Everyone who knew her described her as the smart one, the one who should have done something big. But somewhere along the way, life narrowed. A relationship with a man named Steve Frizzell pulled her into a cycle of pills and heroin that neither could escape. By the early 2000s, Barbara's family had stopped hearing from her regularly. Her daughter, Dominique, went to live with Barbara's sister in Florida. By 2006, Barbara was living in a duplex in Ventnor, doing chores for room and board. On October 17th, she walked out of that house and never came back. Her sisters, Fran and Val, tried to file a missing persons report, but were told she didn't meet the criteria. A 42-year-old woman with a record for prostitution and drug use, police assumed she would turn up. She never did. When they found her body behind the Golden Key Motel a month later, she was still wearing the same jacket she'd last been seen in. Toxicology later showed a potentially lethal dose of heroin in her system, but not enough to explain how she ended up there. For her sisters, that detail would always gnaw at them. If it had been an overdose, why was she face down in a ditch with 3 others? Why were her shoes missing? Then there was Tracy Ann Roberts, just 23. She'd grown up in Delaware and, like so many others, drifted to Atlantic City chasing quick money and a promise that never came. For a while, she worked as a dancer. Later, she began meeting clients on the street. In early November 2006, Tracy called her mother from a hospital bed after being attacked by a man who wanted to be her pimp. She said she was coming home, that she was done with the city. Her mother left immediately, driving 90 minutes from Delaware to pick her up. By the time she arrived, Tracy had checked herself out. The hospital said she'd left with 2 unidentified men. She was never seen again. When her mother got the call weeks later that Tracy was one of the women found behind the motel, she said she'd known, deep down, that her daughter wouldn't make it home. The autopsy showed she died from asphyxiation, but not from hanging or strangulation. It was the kind of suffocation that suggested something deliberate, someone pressing down, taking their time. The final file belonged to Kim Raffo, 35, from Brooklyn. She had once lived an entirely different life: a husband, kids, PTA meetings, summer cookouts. She'd been a mother who volunteered at her children's school and decorated the house for every holiday. Then addiction found its way in, slowly and quietly, until it consumed everything. Her husband took the children and left. Kim followed the trail of people who promised help and ended up in Atlantic City, working odd jobs at diners and motels before turning to sex work to feed her habit. In her last known hours, witnesses said she'd been with a man at the Taj Mahal casino, then left him around dawn to score. She was seen one final time near the boardwalk, walking alone in the direction of the motel corridor. Less than 48 hours later, she was found face down in the ditch, fully clothed but barefoot like the rest. Her autopsy was the clearest. She'd been strangled with a rope or a cord. When detectives spread the 4 timelines across the board, something almost surgical emerged. Molly disappeared first, around early October, Barbara about 10 days later, Tracy around the first week of November, Kim in mid-November. The spacing between each disappearance was nearly identical. It was no longer possible to call this random. Whoever was responsible had been hunting in rhythm, one victim every week and a half, returning again and again to the same quiet stretch of marshland behind the motel. That pattern gave investigators both a direction and a creeping sense of dread. If the killer was following a schedule, he could strike again. Detectives began cross-referencing all 4 women's known contacts. Dealers, clients, shelter addresses, phone records were available. What they found was another layer of connection. Each woman had, at some point, frequented the same small cluster of streets around Pacific Avenue and Tennessee Avenue, the same strip of low-budget motels, the same corners where sex work and drug deals blurred together. It was an invisible map of desperation, and whoever the killer was, he seemed to know it well. Families started coming forward as names became public. Molly's mother spoke softly about her daughter's laugh, about how she loved painting. Barbara's sister described how smart she'd been, how unfair it was that her addiction had become her only label. Tracy's mother could barely speak to reporters. She just said, "She called me. I was on my way." Kim's relatives refused interviews altogether, overwhelmed by the fact that the woman they had once known as a loving mother was now being reduced to another headline about prostitution and drugs. In press conferences, detectives insisted that these women mattered, that their lives weren't throwaway tragedies. But the public narrative was already taking shape. 4 sex workers, all addicts, found in the same ditch. To many, that sounded like something expected, a danger that came with their choices. Inside the precinct, though, the tone was different. The alignment of the bodies, the eastward orientation, the bare feet. It all suggested something ritualistic, something planned. These weren't spur-of-the-moment killings. They were placements. Every investigator who walked that ditch could feel it. Someone had taken time with these women, not in compassion, but in control. And control, in the mind of an organized killer, was everything. In the following weeks, detectives began linking more missing persons from the Atlantic City area, checking if any matched the same pattern, but none did. 4 bodies, 1 site, 1 message. The killer's trail stopped cold after Kim. It was as if he'd vanished or simply moved on. As the community processed the shock, the victims' families tried to reclaim their stories from the headlines. Molly's family buried her in Pennsylvania beneath a small white cross that bore only her name. Barbara's sisters held a private memorial and spoke about her kindness, how she'd once dreamed of owning her own shop. Tracy's mother kept a photograph of her daughter on her dresser and refused to take it down, even years later. Kim's surviving relatives moved out of state, unable to live near the memories of the boardwalk that had taken her. Each of them had been lost to addiction, to poverty, to neglect, and finally to something much darker hiding in plain sight. They were 4 different women, but in death, they'd been shaped into a single narrative, victims of a predator who understood invisibility. He'd found women society had already stopped looking for, and used that silence to cover his tracks. Investigators didn't know it yet, but when they placed those names beside each other on the case board, they were looking at a pattern too precise to be coincidence. 4 lives, spaced like marks on a calendar. 4 bodies, placed like points on a compass. And somewhere out there, the man who had done it was still walking among them, hidden behind the noise of the city, waiting for the next moment when no one was watching. Within 24 hours, the investigation around the Golden Key Motel began to expand outward. The motel itself sat at the edge of the Black Horse Pike, a tired strip of highway that once fed gamblers and tourists into Atlantic City, but now felt more like a forgotten artery. The Golden Key wasn't just a motel, it was a halfway point for people passing through, a refuge for the desperate, and sometimes a trap. The parking lot was cracked, the neon sign buzzed half-lit, and behind it stretched a maze of reeds and mud where the 4 bodies had been found. Detectives started by canvassing every room. Each door told its own story, families living week to week, addicts coming down from highs, couples who'd rather not leave their names on paper. Room 101 belonged to a man named Terry Olson. He was 41, worked construction, and had been staying there on and off during the fall of 2006. When investigators knocked on his door, he seemed nervous but cooperative. He said he'd already heard about the bodies. Everyone had. The news spread faster than the wind off the marsh. Olson told detectives something strange. He claimed that a few weeks earlier, he'd found a pair of muddy work boots on the roof of the motel. He couldn't explain how they got there, but he thought they looked out of place, almost deliberately left. He'd even mentioned it to a motel employee before the discovery of the bodies. When detectives asked if he'd seen anything else, strange cars, people near the ditch at night, he shook his head. He said most nights he worked late and came back exhausted. He didn't notice much. Still, his timing was impossible to ignore. He had been living there during the exact window when the murders occurred. And though he had no known record of violence, he was a convenient name, someone who'd been close to the scene, who might know more than he was saying. Detectives searched his room. They collected clothing, cigarette butts, stray hair fibers. They took his truck from the parking lot and sent it for processing. Olson didn't fight it. He gave them DNA, fingerprints, even volunteered to take a polygraph test. "I didn't kill anyone," he told them. And by all accounts, he passed. Still, rumors spread fast in a city like Atlantic City. People whispered that Olson was too eager to cooperate, that maybe he'd come forward only because he wanted to insert himself into the investigation. Locals who stayed at the motel said he spent a lot of time alone, smoking outside after dark, watching the road. Others described him as quiet, maybe too quiet. The motel's manager told police that most of the tenants were long-term. They knew each other's names, but rarely spoke about their lives. Prostitutes sometimes rented rooms by the week, sometimes just for an hour. The marsh behind the property was a no-man's land. Trash, beer cans, old tires, and now, it seemed, a burial site. Detectives walked the perimeter, their boots sinking into the damp ground. The area was larger than it looked from the highway. The ditch where the women were found was only part of it. To the left stretched several hundred yards of low, soft ground that bled into pine trees. The killer had chosen the perfect place, secluded, shielded by the motel's back fence, close enough to civilization to move unnoticed. Forensic teams spent days collecting samples from the marsh, but the water had done its damage. The silt and standing water had eaten away at fibers, DNA, and trace evidence. The temperature changes between night and day, the rain, and even small animal activity. All of it had destroyed what might have been vital clues. When lab reports started coming in, the results were devastating. No usable DNA, no tire tracks, no fingerprints. The killer had left nothing. It was as if the marsh itself had erased him. Inside the motel, detectives continued interviews. They spoke with a night clerk who remembered seeing a dark-colored sedan parked in the back lot around the same time one of the victims vanished, but couldn't recall the make or plate. A cleaning woman said she'd heard muffled arguing one night, but couldn't say which room it came from. Another guest, a truck driver, mentioned that he'd seen police in the area weeks earlier looking for a missing woman. That woman turned out to be Barbara Brador. Each small detail built an atmosphere, not a lead. Everyone seemed to know something small, but nothing big enough to matter. It was the kind of place where people learned to mind their business, to look away when things didn't seem right. Investigators soon realized that the Golden Key wasn't just a backdrop, it was the common thread. Each victim had spent time in that corridor of motels, cheap diners, and side streets. Molly had been seen near there weeks before her death. Barbara was last seen leaving a duplex just a few miles away. Tracy had checked herself out of the hospital in Atlantic City and disappeared somewhere along that same road. Kim was last seen near the boardwalk, but her body ended up right behind the Golden Key. The location told its own story. The killer didn't drag the victims far. He didn't risk transporting them. He killed close to where he found them, then carried or dragged them a few hundred feet into the marsh. The pattern suggested confidence, maybe even familiarity with the motel's blind spots, the camera angles, the shift changes, the times when traffic on the access road was lightest. Detectives theorized that the killer might have stayed there himself. Maybe a tenant, maybe someone using a fake name. They combed through weeks of check-in records. Some entries were illegible, others fake. The motel's management system was paper-based, and several pages were missing entirely. For the next few months, the case consumed local law enforcement. The name Terry Olson appeared in every press briefing, not as a suspect, but as a person of interest. He never left town, never tried to hide. He kept working, insisting he'd done nothing wrong. But the whispers followed him. Friends stopped visiting, employers hesitated to call. In his own words, he'd later say the suspicion ruined his life. Forensic specialists revisited the ditch months later, hoping winter's dryness might reveal something new. They drained a larger section of the marsh, uncovering small fragments of debris, a broken bracelet, part of a zipper, an old motel key tag that didn't match any current rooms. But again, nothing definitive. The killer had chosen the terrain well. The press dubbed it the Black Horse Pike Murders. Others called it the Eastbound Case, referencing how the bodies had all been found facing the same direction, toward the east, toward the casinos and the ocean beyond. To some, that detail felt ritualistic. To detectives, it suggested control, perhaps even pride. Whoever did this hadn't just killed. He'd staged his victims. In interviews years later, investigators admitted that the Golden Key Motel had haunted them. The place was more than a crime scene. It was a symbol of the city's forgotten edge, where people came to disappear long before anyone put them in the ground. Each room had stories that never made it to paper, and somewhere among them, a killer had blended in. As the investigation widened and evidence thinned, suspicion drifted like the fog that rolled in from the marsh each night. Some believed Olsen was guilty. Others thought the real killer had used the motel as a hunting ground, watching from the dark, slipping back into the reeds when headlights approached. But one fact remained clear. The Golden Key had become a crossroads between life and death. 4 women had vanished into its shadow, and whatever had walked among them was still out there. The detectives who worked the case would never shake that feeling that maybe, just maybe, the killer had stood there that night among the flashing lights, watching as they pulled his victims from the water. And if he had, he would have known something the rest of them didn't. The ditch wasn't his burial ground. It was his signature. Every case we share takes weeks of research, fact-checking, and long nights uncovering the truth. We do this because these stories matter. Every life deserves to be remembered. If you want us to keep bringing these mysteries to light, please like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments which part hit you the hardest. For more mysterious solved cold cases, links are waiting for you in the description. Now, let's get back to the case. Over the weeks that followed, investigators began piecing together the timeline, a fragile thread connecting 4 lives that ended the same way. The sequence that emerged was too clean to be coincidence. 4 women, 5 weeks, each disappearance spaced roughly 10 to 14 days apart. The first, Molly Dilts, went missing sometime in early October. She was the youngest, only 20, and new to the city. Detectives estimated she'd been dead the longest. Her body was the most decomposed, making cause of death impossible to determine. The second, Barbara Bredor, vanished around mid-October. Then came Tracy Ann Roberts in early November. And finally, Kim Raffo, gone just days before the discovery. It wasn't random. Someone had been hunting on a schedule. In the incident room, detectives pinned photographs of each woman to a corkboard. Red string connected locations, dates, and sightings. Ventnor Avenue, the Boardwalk, the Golden Key Motel. Each line crossed the same small pocket of Atlantic City, an area of broken motels and alleys where the city's lights faded into dark marshland. To the public, it looked like coincidence. To investigators, it was a pattern of confidence. Someone who knew the streets well enough to move invisibly, who'd grown bolder with every kill. The medical examiner's reports came back one by one. The findings were grim but revealing. Kim Raffo's cause of death was clear: strangulation, rope or cord, ligature marks around the neck. Tracy Roberts, also asphyxiation, though the exact method was uncertain. Barbara Bredor, undetermined, but her toxicology showed a lethal amount of heroin in her system. Molly, too decomposed to know for sure, though traces of alcohol remained. What stood out wasn't just how they died, it was what was inside them. The lab reports showed alcohol in one, cocaine in 2, heroin in another. It looked chaotic at first, until someone suggested something chilling. Maybe it wasn't chaos at all. Maybe the killer used the women's addictions against them. The idea grew darker with every test result. If the killer had offered them drugs, lured them with what they needed most, then he wouldn't have had to fight them. He could have gained their trust easily, one hit at a time. Then, once they were too high to resist, he could have killed them quietly, face to face. The uniformity of the scene gnawed at the task force. 4 women, all fully clothed, all barefoot, all facing east. That detail became an obsession. Why barefoot? Why east? Psychologists brought in from the state crime lab believed the placement was deliberate. They said whoever did this was organized, methodical, and ritualistic. The bare feet might represent humiliation, vulnerability, or worse, a fetish. It was no longer just murder, it was behavior. An FBI behavioral analyst was consulted. He studied photos of the ditch, the body placement, the water levels. His conclusion was blunt. This was someone comfortable revisiting his work, someone confident he wouldn't be caught. To investigators, it explained the precision of the spacing. 10 days, 4 victims, no sign of panic or escalation. He'd done it before, or at least planned it that way. They began searching for similar cases. Other women found along highways, in water, near motels. That's when a chilling parallel surfaced. Across state lines, in Long Island, New York, police had been dealing with something eerily similar. Women connected to sex work, killed, and left in marshland near Gilgo Beach. The timing wasn't far apart. The methods, strangulation, staging, secluded dump sites, felt like echoes. For weeks, both investigations ran side by side. Detectives compared case files, crime scene photos, and victimology charts. The similarities were undeniable. Both killers targeted vulnerable women. Both preferred isolated areas with water. Both arranged their victims carefully. When New York eventually identified their prime suspect years later, Rex Hoyerman, Atlantic County detectives revisited their evidence, hoping for a match. They found none. Different DNA, different geography, different man. Still, the parallels haunted them. One detective, speaking anonymously years later, said the Eastbound Strangler case felt too disciplined to be a one-time thing. The killer had patience. He didn't kill in bursts. He killed in sequence, pausing just long enough to let the world move on before striking again. As investigators rebuilt the 5-week window, a picture formed of a man moving through the city unseen. He knew where to find women desperate for shelter. He knew when patrols were light. He knew the marsh behind the motel, its darkness, its cover, its silence. The theory was that he met his victims along Pacific or Atlantic Avenue, offered money or drugs, and led them back toward the quieter side streets that bled into the motel's property. Once there, he likely used a vehicle to move them into the marsh. The ditch, with its tall reeds and ankle-deep water, concealed everything. The killer's confidence grew with each murder. Molly's body had been left haphazardly, more exposed. Barbara's placed deeper into the ditch. By the time of Kim and Tracy, the placement was nearly symmetrical. The killer had refined his method, but there was one clue no one could shake: the Eastward Alignment. All 4 women, lying face down, heads pointing toward the Atlantic. It might have been coincidence, or something symbolic. One profiler suggested that the direction could represent cleansing, a kind of perverse ritual. Another believed it was purely practical. The killer might have dragged the bodies from west to east, using the slope of the ditch. Neither theory brought them closer to the truth. As weeks turned to months, the physical evidence grew colder. Rain and tidal runoff destroyed whatever traces might have remained. The marsh became an empty void where answers once might have been. Even the motel, still open and operating, carried its own silence. Guests came and went. Unaware that feet beneath the mud, the ground had once held 4 women no one could save. In the absence of proof, investigators turned inward. They built psychological sketches. Middle-aged male, familiar with Atlantic City, likely employed in a blue-collar trade, possibly someone who stayed at or worked near the motel. He would have appeared ordinary, invisible, capable of charm when needed, predatory when opportunity struck. The theory made sense, but it led nowhere. Every man questioned seemed to fit the mold, and none could be tied to the ditch. Even the polygraph results from their only person of interest, Terry Olson, came back clean. Yet his proximity to the motel and to the murders kept him under quiet surveillance for years. Detectives met in the same conference room where the timeline still hung across the wall. Red lines. 4 names, 5 weeks. The rhythm was impossible to forget. It was the pattern of someone with control, not just over his victims, but over time itself. He decided when it began, and when it stopped. The task force eventually came to a chilling realization. The killer might have lived among them during the investigation, walking the same streets, watching the same nightly news reports. He might have stood outside the tape the day the bodies were found, pretending to be a bystander. If so, he would have known something that no one else did. His sequence was complete. For a brief moment in 2006, the Eastbound Strangler owned the shadows of Atlantic City. Then, like the tide that erased his footprints, he was gone. But even years later, detectives would still look at that timeline. 4 victims, 5 weeks, and wonder if that final gap, those last days before discovery, meant the killer had stopped by choice, or if someone, somewhere, had simply never found the 5th. For weeks after the discovery, the investigation revolved around one name, a man who lived just a few steps from where the bodies had been found, Terry Olson. His room at the Golden Key Motel had faced the marsh, giving him a clear view of the very ditch that had become a grave for 4 women. To detectives, that kind of proximity was impossible to ignore, and to the public, it was all they needed to hear. Once his name leaked, the headlines wrote themselves, "The Motel Suspect. Man linked to Atlantic City murders." Was the killer living among them? Within days, Olson's photograph was everywhere. He wasn't in handcuffs. He hadn't been charged, but to the outside world, he was already guilty. Reporters dug through every corner of his life, old arrest records for petty offenses, past girlfriends, the jobs he'd worked, the ones he'd lost. Each new article painted a darker version of him. Television crews parked outside the motel, filming him as he walked to his truck or tried to smoke a cigarette in peace. They caught the look on his face, tired, hollow, defensive, and replayed it on the evening news. It didn't matter what he said. In Atlantic City, he had become the face of fear. Behind the scenes, detectives were just as focused. Olson had lived in room 101 during the estimated time of the murders. He admitted to hearing strange noises some nights, voices near the back fence, movement in the brush, but claimed he never thought much of it. When investigators pressed him for details, his answers were vague. That alone made them suspicious. He told them about the boots he'd found on the roof, muddy, worn, placed oddly near the vent line. He said he'd told someone about them weeks before the bodies were discovered, but no one remembered the report. He said the boots didn't belong to him, and he didn't know how they got there. For detectives, it was both strange and convenient. When they searched his room, they found nothing incriminating, just clothes, receipts, tools from his construction job. His truck was impounded, swabbed, and tested. Nothing. He gave DNA samples willingly. He volunteered for a polygraph. He passed. But by then, the damage had already been done. Rumors spread through Atlantic City like wildfire. Patrons at nearby bars whispered that he was that guy from the motel. Neighbors who'd once nodded to him now turned away. His employer stopped calling him in for work. Olson went from being a quiet handyman to a pariah. In later interviews, he'd say it ruined his life. Not the police, not the test, but the silence that followed after everyone decided he must be guilty. Months passed, and no new evidence tied him, or anyone else, to the murders. Every test came back negative. The polygraph cleared him. DNA results excluded him. But by the time investigators publicly announced that he was no longer a suspect, no one cared. The story had moved on. The press never ran a headline saying he'd been cleared. For most people, he'd simply faded from view, a footnote in a case that had stopped making sense. Inside the prosecutor's office, the tone had shifted from urgency to quiet frustration. Leads had dried up. The motel was still operating, its sign still flickering over the parking lot, and every room still smelled faintly of mildew and cigarette smoke. The ditch where the women had been found was now cordoned off, overgrown again with reeds and grass. There were no more footprints, no fresh evidence, just a lingering sense that the killer had been right there the entire time and slipped away unseen. For years, detectives revisited the case. New technology came and went. Evidence was retested. Each time, the results came back the same, inconclusive. The eastbound strangler had vanished, leaving no trail, no signature beyond the eerie precision of his crimes. The case was cold, but it never really went away. Then, nearly 17 years later, the headlines returned. July 2023, New York. A man named Rex Hoyerman, a Long Island architect, was arrested in connection with the Gilgo Beach murders, a series of killings that had haunted investigators for more than a decade. The similarities were impossible to ignore. The victims were women connected to sex work. Their bodies had been found in marshland near water, arranged methodically. The media immediately drew the comparison. Within days, talk shows and news outlets were connecting both cases, the Gilgo Four and the Atlantic City Four. The words "possible link" appeared in headlines across the country. For a brief moment, Atlantic County detectives found themselves back in the spotlight. Could the eastbound strangler and the Gilgo Beach killer be the same man? Investigators reopened the old files, dusted off the evidence logs, and began comparing timelines. The murders in New Jersey had occurred in 2006. The earliest known Gilgo Beach victim disappeared around the same time. Both crime scenes were within hours of each other, two coastal areas linked by major highways. Both killers targeted women who were vulnerable, transient, and often forgotten. The staging of the bodies, the alignment, the care, felt eerily familiar. For weeks, speculation grew. Journalists called it the coastal connection. Families of the Atlantic City victims hoped that maybe, after all these years, there would finally be a name. But when the official statement came, it crushed what little hope they had left. On August 1st, 2023, authorities in Atlantic County announced the results of their review. There was no connection, no matching DNA, no shared travel records, no evidence linking Rex Heuermann to New Jersey. The cases, they said, were coincidental, similar in nature, but separate. The eastbound strangler remained unidentified. The news barely made a ripple. Outside of the families and a few retired detectives, few people noticed. The Golden Key Motel had long since been shut down, its sign taken down and the building demolished. The lot where the ditch once ran was now overgrown and silent again. The marsh had swallowed its own history. For the detectives who'd worked the case, it was a quiet kind of defeat. They'd spent years chasing shadows, interrogating men like Olson, comparing notes, re-examining evidence that no longer existed. Each time, they came up empty. The killer was gone, maybe dead, maybe living somewhere under another name, but gone all the same. And yet, something about the case still haunted them. The precision, the rhythm, the control. Most serial offenders left a trail eventually, a mistake, a witness, a clue. But whoever had done this had left nothing. Just 4 women, placed like a message no one could read. When investigators spoke about it years later, they described the same feeling. It wasn't that they'd failed to find the killer. It was that they could still feel him there, the motel, the ditch, the alignment of bodies. It all felt like his signature was still wet on the ground, waiting for someone to notice what they'd missed. By the end of 2023, the eastbound strangler had become more ghost than man, a shadow that haunted cold case files and internet forums. Every few years, someone would bring up the case again, connecting it to a new suspect or a fresh crime scene, but the pattern never matched perfectly. The evidence never aligned. For the families, there was nothing left to hold onto except the silence. For investigators, only the echo of what they'd once seen behind the Golden Key Motel. A ditch, 4 bodies, and a killer who had somehow disappeared without ever leaving. The case had started with a man everyone suspected. It ended with no one at all, and in that space, in the gap between guilt and absence, the eastbound strangler became something worse than a name. He became a reminder of how evil can exist, vanish, and still be felt long after the lights go out. The Golden Key. Motel is gone now. The building was demolished years ago, the cracked parking lot replaced with weeds and gravel, but locals still avoid that patch of ground after dark. They say the marsh never felt right again. The air there is heavy, the kind that goes still when you walk too close. Even though the ditch was filled in long ago, people swear they can still hear the water moving beneath the soil. Every November, around the anniversary of the discovery, a few cars pull off the road near where the sign once stood. Families of the 4 women, Molly, Barbara, Tracy, and Kim, come quietly, carrying flowers. They park, walk through the grass, and stop near the tree line where the marsh used to open into the ditch. There's no memorial there, no official marker, just an empty space that holds their absence. Some years, the wind is so strong the flowers won't stay upright. The families press them into the ground anyway. They come back every year because it's all they have left, a piece of earth where their daughters were last found together. Detectives who worked the case still talk about it in fragments. Some retired, others moved to different units, but the memory follows them. They describe how the motel once stood like a shadow against the highway, lights flickering, people coming and going, the same few faces passing through. When they think back now, what haunts them most isn't the violence. It's the realization that the killer almost certainly lived among them. Someone who smiled at clerks, filled up his gas tank, waved to neighbors. Someone who saw those women struggling and decided they didn't deserve to live. In interviews years later, one investigator said something that stayed with the families. He didn't come from far away. Whoever did this already knew the marsh. That line stuck because it made sense. The ditch was hidden from the road, but easy to reach if you knew where to look. It was a place known only to locals, maintenance workers, motel staff, long-haul drivers, or anyone who'd spent time on the Black Horse Pike after midnight. The case files still exist, packed into boxes and stored in the Atlantic County archives. They're marked with dates and evidence tags that have faded with time. Inside are the photographs, grainy prints of the crime scene, notes from early interviews, autopsy reports, and a handful of small items sealed in plastic. Among them are degraded DNA samples, too weak to test fully when they were first collected, but preserved just in case technology caught up. In the past few years, advances in genetic genealogy have solved cases once thought impossible. Investigators have seen it happen elsewhere. A fragment of DNA, a single hair, leading to a name no one expected. That possibility still gives them hope, even after nearly 2 decades. Every few months, someone at the prosecutor's office revisits the evidence, running a new test or checking a new database. Each time they say, maybe this will be the one that breaks it open. So far it hasn't, but they keep the samples carefully frozen, waiting for the day science can finally speak for the victims. For the families, hope is quieter. They've learned not to expect answers, only to keep the story alive. Barbara's sister once said she no longer cared about punishment. She just wanted a name, a face to go with the fear that had lived in her head for years. Kim's daughter, grown now, told a reporter she dreams about a phone call from police saying the words, "We found him." Molly's mother visits her grave in Pennsylvania and leaves seashells instead of flowers. She says they remind her that her daughter's final days were spent near the ocean. The town has changed since 2006. The casinos rise taller now, the streets near the boardwalk cleaner, but just outside the city limits, the marsh still looks the same. At night, fog drifts in from the bay, covering the old highway in white mist. Truckers who stop along the shoulder say they sometimes feel watched. Others refuse to pull over anywhere near the old motel site. For them, it's not superstition, it's memory. Everyone who lived here then remembers where they were the day they heard about the bodies. It's one of those stories that never really left. Investigators have always said the most haunting part of the case is how ordinary it all was. 4 women disappeared in the same small city, within weeks of each other, and not one person saw it happen. No one called it in. No one reported hearing screams or seeing a car. Even when families tried to file missing persons reports, they were told to wait, to give it time, to understand that addicts and sex workers often drifted. That delay may have given the killer all the time he needed. The case became more than an investigation. It became a mirror reflecting everything people wanted to ignore. Addiction, poverty, the way society looks past the vulnerable until it's too late. Each woman had once been part of a family, loved, full of hope. But by the time they reached Atlantic City, most had slipped through every safety net meant to protect them. And that's where he found them, alone, unseen, unguarded. There are theories, of course. Some believe the killer was someone who worked in construction nearby, a man who could come and go without suspicion. Others think he might have been a client who gained the women's trust before turning on them. A few believe he died years ago, taking his secret with him. The truth is that no one knows. The only certainty is that he understood the city's blind spots better than anyone. He knew which women wouldn't be missed right away, which ditches would stay undisturbed, which places the police rarely checked. Every so often, new detectives take a look at the file, hoping to see something their predecessors didn't. They study the maps, the photos, the alignment of the bodies. One of them said that when he saw the old crime scene pictures for the first time, the detail that struck him most wasn't the number of victims or the placement. It was how close they were to safety. The motel was right there. The road, the traffic, the lights from the city skyline, all within sight. And still, no one heard them. No one saw a thing. That question lingers like fog over the marsh even now. How 4 women could die the same way, in the same place, within view of a motel, without a single witness. For the families, anniversaries come and go. Reporters occasionally reach out for updates, but there's rarely anything new to say. The same theories resurface, the same rumors, the same old photographs. But every year, when the wind cuts cold and the grass bends low over the marsh, someone drives past and slows down. They might not stop, but they look. They remember. Police still believe the answer exists somewhere in those few square miles of Atlantic County, buried not in the marsh, but in the memory of someone who was there, someone who saw something, someone who knows. Until that person comes forward, or science finally reveals what time has hidden, the eastbound strangler will remain what he's always been, a shadow on the edge of the city, a ghost that never left the water. And for Atlantic City, no matter how bright the boardwalk lights shine, the story of what was found behind the Golden Key Motel still hangs heavier than all of them. It's the reminder that beneath the noise and the neon, silence still has a voice. And in that silence, the marsh still whispers the same question that's haunted everyone since that November day. Who did this? And how did no one see him?